Si apre la seconda sessione del workshop. Chiusa la prima, è naturale arrivare a parlare adesso del concetto di pacificazione. Come strumento di controllo è intesa come riduzione delle popolazioni riottose ad una sottomissione pacifica, attraverso un'azione combinata di forza e politica. La forza per distruggere il nemico, la politica per costruire un nuovo ordine ideologico sopra le ceneri del vecchio. Il primo relatore, che ho sulla mia destra, è Ben Ice del TNI, introdurrà il tema della guerra presentando il World and the Pacification Project, un progetto che ricostruisce nessi fra militarizzazione, security e globalizzazione. Gli interventi di Mark Nucleus e Guglielmina Seri si articoleranno attorno al concetto di pacificazione. What is the pacification? Il primo è pacificazione contro l'estrattivismo, rivisitare le politiche del capitale in America Latina, il secondo. Passo la parola a Ben Ice, introducendolo con una breve biografia, e collabora col TNI come ricercatore indipendente e consulente in materia di politiche di sicurezza, antiterrorismo, controllo delle frontiere e protezione dei dati. Ha lavorato nel Regno Unito con l'Organizzazione per le Libertà Civili, col Centro Europeo per i Diritti Costituzionali ed Umani, per i rifugiati, con varie associazioni, col Parlamento Europeo, con la Commissione Europea. È un membro del collettivo di sicurezza umana e un ricercatore presso il PRIO, Peace Research Institute Oslo. Importante la sua inchiesta sulla sicurezza industriale europea, pubblicata dal TNI. Si interessa di privacy, libertà civili, organizzazioni umanitarie. Collabora con vari gruppi di ricerca dell'Unione Europea, del Consiglio Europeo e Commissione Europea. Ha coeditato un libro sulle implicazioni del cambiamento climatico, più come questione di sicurezza che di giustizia ambientale. Grazie.
Okay, thanks Stefania. Buongiorno a tutti, mi dispiace che non posso parlare in italiano, la prossima volta forse. So I want to start by thanking all of the organisers, as everyone has, and I also want to thank the previous panel just for setting out in sort of such terrifying detail what's been happening, you know, down here, and also with the No TAV movement. It's kind of a depressingly familiar story, and I think, you know, you're going to be hearing about how similar a lot of the things that you've been facing down here are to what is happening in other parts of the world. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the TransNational Institute's War and Pacification program, where it came from, and sort of how we came to be here, why we wanted to come and put this event on with partners down here, and the sort of the thinking behind that and the significance of it. So just to give you a sort of introduction to the TransNational Institute, my colleague Neve spoke a little about it this morning, but we've been around for 40 years. We work in 5 broad areas. We have a sort of economic justice focus, which is looking at trade and investment and corporate power. We have a sort of environmental and agricultural justice program, which is looking at things like land grabbing, climate change. We have a new politics program, which is looking at the kind of political forces and movements and actors that we need to sort of to develop and implement this work. We have a drugs and democracy program, which is all about alternatives to the war on drugs and harm reduction. And then finally, we have what is for us quite a new war and pacification program. And what we're trying to do in all of our work is really do sort of cutting edge research and analysis, you know, academically rigorous analysis of sort of transnational issues that are affecting communities all across the world. And within that, we're trying to put forward alternatives to neoliberalism, to authoritarianism, and most importantly, to work with social movements to try to build the kind of world we want to see and to try to defend the one we have, frankly. So the history of our program, as I said, TNI has been around for 40 years, and initially this program was called the Peace and Security Program, and it really came out of a sort of history anchored in the anti-imperialist, anti-war struggles of the post-war era, you know, the 60s, the 70s and the 80s, when we were concerned with sort of, you know, things like post-colonial struggles against colonialism, things like the proliferation of nuclear weapons, the implications of sort of Cold War geopolitics. So the Peace and Security Program, as it was then, was really about confronting empire and sort of, you know, creating a secure world free of things like nuclear weapons. And obviously the world has, for us and for everybody, sort of changed immeasurably since that period. We've had the collapse of the USSR, you know, we now live in a multipolar world. And a few things I think in particular, I'm going to start with the events of 9/11, have really changed everything for sort of the kind of work we do and the kind of problems that we're confronting in our work. And so, you know, the war part of the War on Pacification program is really about confronting the global war on terrorism. You know, the Project for a New American Century, which preceded the Bush administration and its response to the terrorist attacks of 9/11, you know, talked about the US needing to be able to fight multiple wars in multiple countries throughout the 21st century. And the response to 9/11 really heralded this kind of era of permanent war that we now find ourselves in. It also, you know, constructed a new enemy within. First and most obviously Muslim communities, but the kinds of mechanisms and structures that were put in place to deal with those have gradually been extended to target other communities, as I'm going to come on to. So we've seen this sort of massive expansion of state power in the name of countering terrorism, and commensurate with that is a massive intrusion into civil liberties. We heard a bit about this in the previous panel. You know, we've seen the creation of a separate justice system to deal with terrorist suspects, and then we've steadily seen these new powers used for non-terrorist purposes. We've seen the consolidation and emergence, partly through the new technologies that we all use, but, you know, we now live in an era of mass surveillance, as was, you know, laid bare by Edward Snowden's revelations of a few years ago. And we're now confronting what we at TNI sort of refer to as War on Terror 2.0. You know, the war on terrorism as it was first conceived by the neocons, and as it happens made permanent by Liberal Democrats. That war on terrorism has now sort of morphed into a much more nebulous war on extremism. This whole new paradigm that, you know, we don't just need to go after terrorist groups, but we need to go after extremist ideologies, the far right, the far left, extremism in all of its forms. And these are policies that sort of have roots in countries like Britain, where I come from, but which are now being globalized through entities like the European Union and the United Nations, which have taken up these frameworks and embraced them. And what that's really left is states have got a kind of what we would call a blank check, to sort of a massive discretion to exercise these new powers against specific groups of people, against social movements, against potentially anyone who does not buy into the dominant ideology, or anyone who wants to challenge and confront power. and sort of taking this a bit further, you know, the war on terror has really also created this kind of endless feedback loop. You know, these wars abroad, absolutely disastrous wars abroad, they've destroyed whole countries, destabilized entire regions, you know, and produced massive displacement, refugee flows, and then this in turn has been used to justify further militarization of our borders. We've also seen under the war on terror a massive transfer of technology, of powers, of structures from the military to the civil realm. You know, the militarization of policing, of security. And all of this, I think, has really paved the way for the more extreme forms of authoritarian populism that we're now seeing. You know, social democratic liberal governments sort of nailed their colours to the mast and said immigration and terrorism are the biggest problems we face. And then, you know, the likes of Trump and the far right in Europe have come along and said, well, we're, you know, out of the way, we're going to show you what this really looks like. And I don't think I think a lot of the people who are talking about trying to confront authoritarianism haven't really taken into account where all this has come from and what has paved the way for it. So I just wanted to talk, in the little time I have left, about a couple of the areas of the work we do. We have a series or a work stream which we call Border Wars, which is really looking, as I mentioned before, at the militarization of borders, at the globalization of border security, the criminalization of refugees, but not just refugees, the people who try to support them, and the way that borders have really become a testing ground for ostensibly liberal societies about what is permissible, a testing ground for and an incubator for new technologies of control that begin at the border and are gradually rolled out into other areas of policing and security. Key to all of this, again, post 9/11, has been the massive expansion of the security industry. You know, it barely existed before 9/11. Now, the security industry it's $100 billion a year enterprise, and it's really the result of the diversification of the defense sector, the arms trade, into all things homeland security post 9/11, and it hasn't happened by accident. It's happened very deliberately. You know, after 9/11, the Bush administration in the US started investing, you know, billions of dollars into developing new technologies of control, and entities like the European Union responded by saying, look, we also have to support our security industries, or, you know, we're going to be dependent on US security, whatever, Chinese technologies. So, you know, it's now a policy priority for the European Union to have a globally competitive homeland security sector. And with that, we've basically seen, you know, the industry move into all things security. Neve mentioned, you know, the fence around the site that you all went to see yesterday. You know, I didn't see it myself, but one of my colleagues who was there said, look, you know, I'm a veteran of a lot of these kinds of protests, and that is some fence. And to that I would add, you know, fences itself, you know, borders are now a global enterprise, and I'd be very surprised if there hadn't been some international expertise that had gone into constructing that. And what we've tried to show within our work and our research and analysis is that, you know, once you prioritize the interests of the homeland security industry, it starts to change the values and structures of political culture. You know, it gives you a perverse incentive to spy, to arrest, to detain, even to torture. And it relies on the kind of sustaining the very politics of fear that created the industry in the first place, right? The bottom line, if you want to sell security, is keeping people afraid. So we've tried to sort of frame this as post 9/11, we've entered into a sort of new kind of arms race, but it's one in which all the weapons are pointed inwards. It's one which promises, again, we heard a bit about this morning, it promises to divide the world into a world of red zones and green zones, of safe places and dangerous places. And it promises to securitize everything, schooling, public services, the response to climate change. And then lastly, you know, we've become really interested in how all of this, and this is really what's brought us here, or one of the things that's brought us here today, how all of this is impacting social movements and activists, as I said at the beginning, you know, the very people that we need to build the kind of world we want to live in, or to preserve the things we have today. And I guess we've been doing this through the lens and the discourse of shrinking space, and I don't know how well this concept translates into Italian, but sort of over the last probably 5 years, sort of think tanks and some liberal democratic governments have sort of begun to talk about the way in which the space for political activism is shrinking. And, you know, there's benefits to these kinds of conversations because, you know, it's opened up the space to talk about these things in venues that previously didn't entertain these conversations. But it's also quite problematic for us as a way of looking at what is happening, for instance, on the ground, you know, for movements like No TAP. And the reason we find it quite problematic is it's a very apolitical discourse. You know, what we're really talking about is brutal repression, you know, straight up criminalization, you know, massive surveillance, police brutality. And I think, you know, when we start to talk about that in more apolitical terms, yes, it allows some people who are less comfortable having those conversations to enter the debate, but it also often does a disservice to the activists on the ground who are at the front line of this. We also find that the shrinking space conversation is often, you know, it's not grounded in the kind of wider political and economic context which I've been describing. But, you know, we have a shrinking space program, and we have, you know, we have published papers on, you know, the shrinking space for refugee and migrant solidarity, showing, you know, looking a lot at the state's response to the humanitarian rescue ships in the Mediterranean, to activists trying to defend the rights of migrants and refugees. But we've also shown this is not something that's isolated to Italy, right? This is happening right across the European Union. We've got a paper coming out on the criminalization of the BDS movement. You know, there can be no more glaring example of shrinking space than what is happening to the BDS movement across the world. And so I'll stop there because I know I've used up my 15 minutes, but the result of where we've got to now is that, you know, we want to try to change the discourse a bit and really focus and ground our work in a context that really speaks to, you know, the economic and political realities of the world we're living in. And that's why we've been working with Mark, who I'll hand over to, just to sort of try to give a framing to our program, which is, as I said, the War and Pacification program. And at this point, it's an opportune moment for Mark to explain to you all what pacification theory is and why it's relevant to the conversations we're going to have over the next couple of days. So thanks all for coming, thanks all for being here, and I wish you great discussions for the next few days. Thanks.